The morning of May 5, 1943. 43 merchant ships stretched across 6 miles of grey North Atlantic water, Convoy ONS-5 steaming westbound from Liverpool to Halifax. Commander Peter Gretton stood on the bridge of HMS Duncan, lead escort of the B-7 group, watching his radar screen paint a picture that defied every instinct drilled into him during 20 years of naval service. 7. Surfaced, closing from dead ahead. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 7 submarines against 5 escort vessels. 43 slow merchantmen carrying ballast and trade goods, wallowing through moderate seas at 8 knots. The torpedo danger zone extended 2 miles in every direction from the convoy's edge. Any U-boat penetrating that perimeter had a 25% chance of hitting multiple targets with a single spread. Gretton's hand moved toward the signal lamp. His orders would determine whether 43 ships and over 2,000 men lived or died in the next 30 minutes. Standard doctrine from the Great War remained clear. Turn away from torpedo tracks. Put your stern to the enemy. Use your speed to outrun the weapons. But Gretton had spent the previous 6 months at the Western Approaches Tactical Unit in Liverpool, moving model ships across a linoleum floor, while young women's Royal Naval Service members played the roles of U-boat commanders. He had learned something that contradicted every tactical manual published since 1916. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The lesson learned on that floor would determine the outcome of the most decisive convoy battle of the Second World War. Turn toward the torpedoes. Not away from them, toward them. It was called combing the tracks, and it would transform naval warfare. The Battle of Jutland, May 31st, 1916, had written original rules. Admiral Sir John Jellicoe commanded the British Grand Fleet, 28 dreadnought battleships and 9 battlecruisers, the most powerful naval force assembled since Trafalgar. Opposite him, Admiral Reinhard Scheer commanded the German High Seas Fleet, smaller but formidable, 16 dreadnoughts and 5 battlecruisers. At 7:22 in the evening, with daylight fading across the North Sea, Jellicoe's battleships had achieved the tactical dream crossing the T. The British line stretched across the German fleet's path, every British gun bearing on the leading German ships, while German vessels could only reply with forward turrets. Scheer was trapped, his fleet facing annihilation. Then German destroyers launched their torpedoes. 31 weapons, churning through cold North Sea water at 44 knots, tracks visible as white lines of bubbles in the failing light. British lookouts spotted them at 8,000 yards, 4 miles, 6 minutes until impact. Jellicoe issued the order that shaped naval doctrine for the next quarter century. Turn away, 2 points to port, then 4 more points. The entire Grand Fleet, 28 battleships steaming at 20 knots, turning their sterns to the torpedoes, opening the range, racing away from the German weapons. Not a single British battleship was hit. The tactic worked perfectly, but in those critical minutes, as British ships steamed away at combined speeds exceeding 40 knots, Scheer's battered fleet escaped into the gathering darkness. The German Navy, cornered and beaten, survived to fight another day. The Royal Navy studied Jutland obsessively, thousands of pages of analysis, hundreds of tactical exercises. The lessons seemed clear. Modern torpedoes, with their long range and devastating warheads, had fundamentally changed naval combat. The prudent commander turned away from torpedo attack. Survival trumped aggression. Captain Russell Grenfell, a British destroyer officer who served in the Grand Fleet, later wrote that Jellicoe's caution was understandable, given what was known in 1916. The British had overestimated German torpedo capabilities, believing enemy weapons could reach 18,000 yards when their actual range was closer to 10,000. Fear of the unknown weapon had driven tactical doctrine toward excessive caution. But there was another way. A minority of officers, including some who had been at Jutland, argued that turning away sacrificed the fundamental naval principle of maintaining contact with the enemy. They proposed an alternative: turn toward the torpedoes, Present the narrowest possible target your bow instead of your broadside. Comb through the tracks like a needle through fabric. Maintain aggressive contact with the enemy while minimizing your vulnerability. Critics called this suicidal. Conventional wisdom held that turning into a torpedo spread increased your chances of being hit. You were closing the range, giving yourself less time to maneuver, potentially running directly into a weapon that might otherwise have missed. The debate remained theoretical until the Second World War forced tactical evolution through brutal experience. Captain Gilbert Roberts had retired from the Royal Navy in 1938 after a career that included commanding destroyers and minesweepers. Heart problems had ended his seagoing service. When war came in September 1939, Roberts was 51 years old, living quietly in civilian life, seemingly done with military service. Then, in 1941, after massive convoy losses demonstrated that the Navy was losing the Battle of the Atlantic, Roberts wrote to the Admiralty. He proposed creating a tactical school where convoy escort commanders could practice responding to U-boat attacks through wargaming. The concept wasn't new. The German Navy had used tactical exercises extensively between the wars, but the British had largely abandoned such training. Admiral Sir Percy Noble, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, was sceptical but desperate. Merchant ship losses had reached catastrophic levels. In November 1940, Convoy SC-7 had lost 21 of 35 ships. Convoy HX-79 lost 12 of 49 ships. U-boats were sinking vessels faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. Noble gave Roberts permission to establish the Western Approaches Tactical Unit in a building in Liverpool. Roberts received no budget, minimal staff support, and explicit instructions not to bother the Commander-in-Chief with his experiments. What Roberts created would revolutionize anti-submarine warfare. The top floor of the building at Derby House became a giant game board. White lines on dark linoleum represented convoy lanes. Model ships, beautifully detailed miniatures of merchantmen, destroyers, and corvettes, moved across the floor, representing time intervals and speeds. Pieces of string showed torpedo tracks. Coloured markers indicated sonar contacts and radar returns. Roberts recruited Women's Royal Naval Service members to operate the game. These women, called wrens, were typically 18 to 22 years old, most with no naval experience beyond basic training. But Roberts trained them meticulously. Some played convoy commodores, others played escort commanders, still others played U-boat captains, using actual German tactical manuals captured from sunken submarines. The realism was extraordinary. Wrens, operating as U-boat commanders, received the same intelligence that real U-boats obtained: convoy positions, estimated speeds, weather conditions. They had to make the same tactical decisions German commanders made: where to position for attack, when to dive, how to approach through the escort screen. Escort commanders playing the game faced the same challenges as their counterparts at sea: limited radar range, ASDIC that worked poorly in rough seas, too few ships to cover all approaches. The need to balance protecting the convoy with aggressive anti-submarine action. Roberts observed hundreds of games. Patterns emerged, mistakes repeated, but most importantly, solutions developed. In December 1941, Roberts noticed something peculiar. Wrens playing U-boat commanders were consistently achieving better attack positions than intelligence reports suggested German submarines actually achieved. The game showed U-boats penetrating escort screens and attacking from within the convoy columns. But actual convoy losses showed a different pattern. Roberts obtained detailed reports from recent convoy battles. In one case, HMS Anavor, a merchant ship in the center of a convoy, had been torpedoed. The convoy commodore assumed the U-boat had fired from outside the escort screen. The torpedo had traveled thousands of yards through multiple columns of ships. Roberts recreated the battle on his floor. Following the escort movements exactly as described in official reports, he ran the scenario multiple times. Each time, the same question emerged. If the U-boat fired from outside the convoy, how had the torpedo reached Anavor without hitting any of the ships in front of her? Late one evening, after most staff had left, Roberts asked Jean Laidlaw and Janet O'Kell, two of his wrens, to reset the game. This time, Roberts placed the U-boat model inside the convoy columns. He ran the attack sequence again. The solution became obvious. The U-boat hadn't fired from outside the escort screen. It had penetrated the screen, surfaced between convoy columns under cover of darkness, and fired at point-blank range from inside the formation. This was audacious, dangerous, and completely contrary to what British naval intelligence believed about U-boat tactics. But it explained the convoy's losses perfectly. Roberts telephoned Admiral Sir Max Horton, who had replaced Noble as Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches in November 1942. Horton was a former submariner himself, one of the Royal Navy's most successful submarine commanders during the Great War. "Sir," Roberts asked carefully, "during the last war, would you ever have crept among the ships of a convoy to fire a torpedo?" Horton's response was immediate. "Of course, it is the only way of pressing home an attack." This single conversation changed British convoy defence doctrine. If U-boats were attacking from inside convoy formations, then escort ships needed new tactics to counter this threat. More importantly, the entire defensive posture needed to shift from passive protection to aggressive hunting. Roberts developed new counter-tactics through systematic gaming. The solution involved geometric patterns called raspberry and artichoke, searches escorts sweeping through specific areas in coordinated patterns designed to flush U-boats from hiding positions between convoy columns. But the most important tactical innovation involved how escorts responded to torpedo tracks. In early 1943, Roberts set up a demonstration for Admiral Horton. The scenario involved a wolf-pack attack on a slow convoy, multiple U-boats attacking simultaneously from different angles. This was Germany's most effective tactic, pioneered by Admiral Karl Dönitz, overwhelming convoy escorts through sheer numbers. Roberts assigned Wrens to command the escort group. He had trained them in conventional tactics, the standard responses taught at Royal Navy schools: turn away from torpedo tracks, increase speed, open the range. The result was catastrophic. The Wrens, playing as U-boat commanders, systematically destroyed the convoy. Torpedoes fired from multiple angles created crossing tracks. Ships turning away from one spread turned directly into another. The escorts, focused on evading torpedoes, lost contact with attacking U-boats. Admiral Horton watched grimly as model merchantmen were removed from the board, representing vessels sunk. When the game concluded, 22 of 42 ships had been destroyed. Roberts reset the game. Same convoy, same wolf pack, same initial conditions. But this time, he gave the Wrens commanding escorts a single new instruction. When you spot torpedo tracks, turn toward them, not away, toward. The Wrens hesitated. The order contradicted every instinct, but they followed instructions. The result astonished everyone in the room. Ships turning into torpedo tracks presented minimal target profiles. Torpedoes set to run at specific depths for broadside hits missed vessels that turned bow on. The narrow frontal area of a ship, perhaps 40 feet wide, versus the broadside area, 300 to 500 feet long, meant a dramatic reduction in probability of being hit. More importantly, escorts turning toward threats maintained contact with attacking U-boats. Instead of opening range, they closed it. U-boats, expecting escorts to turn away, suddenly faced destroyers and corvettes charging, directly toward them at maximum speed. The psychological impact proved as important as the tactical advantages. U-boat commanders, accustomed to escorts retreating from torpedo attacks, found themselves targeted by aggressive counterattacks. Depth charges fell around submarines that had expected to remain unmolested while escorts evaded. Admiral Horton stood and walked onto the game floor. He studied the positions of model ships, the string representing torpedo tracks, the final positions showing the convoy largely intact. "What do you call this maneuver?" Horton asked. Roberts had prepared for the question. "Combing the tracks, sir, like a comb through hair. You slide through parallel to the tracks, presenting minimum profile." Horton approved the tactic for fleet-wide implementation. Within weeks, escort commanders throughout Western Approaches Command received new tactical instructions. The doctrine developed through wargaming on a Liverpool floor became official Royal Navy policy, but tactical manuals and actual combat are separated by the vast gulf of human courage under fire. Convoy ONS-5 departed Liverpool on April 21, 1943. 43 merchant ships, a mixture of British, Norwegian, Dutch and American vessels, organized into 9 columns with 5 ships per column. The convoy commodore, Captain Samuel White, sailed aboard the freighter Abraham Lincoln in column 6. The escort group, designated B-7, consisted of 2 destroyers, HMS Duncan and HMS Vidette, along with 4 corvettes, HMS Sunflower, HMS Snowflake, HMS Tay, and HMS Loosestrife. Commander Peter Gretton commanded from Duncan. He had been through the tactical unit in Liverpool. He knew about combing the tracks. The convoy's mission was simple: sail in ballast from Liverpool to Halifax, where ships would load cargo for the return journey. These westbound convoys carried less valuable cargoes than eastbound convoys, but they were essential to the Atlantic supply chain. Empty ships returning for more cargo maintained the flow of materials, keeping Britain in the war. The route took ONS-5 through the most dangerous waters of the Atlantic. The Black Pit, as convoy crews called it, the mid-ocean gap, where shore-based aircraft from neither Britain nor Newfoundland could provide air cover. In this gap, roughly 600 miles wide in early 1943, U-boats could operate with relative impunity. German Admiral Karl Dönitz had positioned 40 U-boats across the expected convoy routes. Group Star 30 U-boats formed a patrol line 300 miles south of Greenland. Group Specht, another 10 boats, covered approaches further north. This concentration represented the largest commitment of U-boat strength to a single operation since the war began. German B-Dienst, the Signals Intelligence Service, had broken British convoy codes. Dönitz knew ONS-5's departure date, approximate route, and composition. He positioned his submarines accordingly, creating a gauntlet the convoy would have to pass through. The first week passed without incident. ONS-5 made steady progress westward, zigzagging during daylight hours to complicate U-boat attack solutions. The weather remained poor, typical North Atlantic conditions with heavy seas and frequent rain squalls. Poor visibility helped the convoy avoid detection. On April 28, a German reconnaissance aircraft spotted ONS-5. The sighting report reached U-boat headquarters in France. Dönitz immediately ordered Group Star to intercept. The hunt was on. The weather deteriorated into a full gale. Winds exceeded 50 knots. Seas built to 30 feet. The convoy scattered. Merchant ships, struggling to maintain formation in mountainous seas, lost sight of their neighbours. Some ships hove to, riding out the storm rather than risk collision. Others pressed on, trusting their navigation to bring them back to the convoy when weather improved. Commander Gretton faced a crisis. His convoy, already vulnerable to submarine attack, had disintegrated across hundreds of square miles of ocean. His escort ships, designed for anti-submarine warfare, were too small to maintain effective station-keeping in such conditions. Duncan's ASDIC sonar was virtually useless in the turbulent water sound waves scattered by bubbles, and turbulence couldn't maintain contact with submerged targets. The storm that threatened to destroy the convoy also saved it. U-boats attempting to maintain contact with ONS-5 lost the scattered merchantmen in poor visibility. Submarines, with their low profiles, were nearly swamped by the massive seas. Several U-boats reported storm damage, forcing them to break off pursuit and return to base. By May 1st, the weather moderated. ONS-5 slowly reformed. 40 ships answered signals from the convoy commodore. 3 had aborted due to damage or fuel concerns. The convoy continued westward, now 5 days behind schedule but largely intact. Then U-boats made contact again. May 4th, 1943. At 8:30 in the evening, HMS Duncan's radar detected a surfaced U-boat at 6,000 yards. The submarine, U-258, was shadowing the convoy, transmitting position reports to guide other boats in Group Star toward the target. Gretton ordered Duncan to maximum speed 36 knots and steered directly for the contact. U-258 crash-dived as the destroyer approached. Gretton dropped a pattern of 10 depth charges on the estimated position. The explosions sent columns of water 200 feet into the air. Underwater, the shock waves created overpressure that could crack a submarine's pressure hull, rupture pipes, shatter gauges. U-258 survived the attack, but sustained damage requiring her to return to base. One U-boat eliminated from the battle, but there were 39 more. Throughout the night of May 4th to 5th, U-boats positioned themselves around ONS-5. German tactics called for patience. Multiple submarines would shadow the convoy from beyond radar range, waiting for darkness. Then, on signal from the Wolfpack commander, all boats would attack simultaneously from different angles. The attack began at 1:30 in the morning on May 5th. HMS Snowflake, a corvette patrolling the convoy's port side, made radar contact at 5,200 yards. Lieutenant Harold Chesterman commanded Snowflake, a Flower-class corvette, 208 feet long, displacing 950 tons, armed with a single 4-inch gun and depth charge racks. The corvette could make 16 knots maximum speed. Chesterman turned toward the contact. This was the critical moment. Conventional doctrine said to turn parallel to the contact, maintaining distance while attempting to keep the U-boat submerged. Roberts's new doctrine said charge directly at the threat. Chesterman ordered full speed ahead. Snowflake's single screw thrashed water as the corvette accelerated toward the U-boat. At 500 yards, the submarine turned away and fired 2 torpedoes from stern tubes while diving. Chesterman watched the torpedo wakes approaching, white lines visible in bioluminescent water, both tracks heading directly for Snowflake. Time seemed to slow. The torpedoes were running at 44 knots. Snowflake was making 16 knots. Closing speed 60 knots, 100 feet per second. Every instinct screamed to turn away. Present the stern, try to outrun the weapons. But Chesterman held course directly toward the torpedo tracks. Bow on to the approaching weapons. The first torpedo passed 20 yards to starboard. The second passed 20 yards to port. Both weapons missed a target that, presenting its broadside, would have been 300 feet wide. By turning bow on, Snowflake reduced her target profile to approximately 35 feet the width of her bow. The corvette overran the diving position and dropped 10 depth charges. The explosions damaged U-532, forcing her to abort and return to base. But this was just the beginning. At 2:52 in the morning, HMS Oribe detected U-125 on radar at 200 yards point-blank range in naval combat. The destroyer's lookouts spotted the U-boat's conning tower silhouetted against the night sky. The submarine had penetrated the escort screen, exactly as Gilbert Roberts's war games had predicted. Oribe turned directly toward U-125 and accelerated. The destroyer's bow struck the submarine's conning tower at 20 knots, 7,000 tons of steel warship, colliding with a partially submerged submarine. The impact bent Oribe's bow and damaged her forward compartments, but the submarine suffered catastrophic damage to her conning tower. U-125 attempted to dive, but water flooding through the damaged conning tower made depth control impossible. The submarine surfaced again at 3:54. HMS Snowflake, alerted by Oribe's contact report, approached the 10, crippled U-boat. Lieutenant Chesterman could see the submarine clearly in Snowflake's searchlight at 100 yards. The conning tower was wrecked. Crew members were abandoning ship. The Germans detonated scuttling charges. U-125 sank with all hands. The battle continued throughout the pre-dawn hours. 7 U-boats launched attacks on ONS-5. The Convoy's escorts intercepted 6 of them using aggressive tactics. Turn toward the threat, close the range, force the submarine down before it could achieve firing position. At 5:30 in the morning, U-258 managed to penetrate the escort screen while submerged. Rising to periscope depth as the convoy passed overhead, the submarine fired 2 torpedoes at the merchant ship McKeesport. One torpedo struck the freighter on the starboard bow. McKeesport, carrying ballast, began flooding immediately. HMS Northern Gem, a corvette serving as rescue ship, detected U-258 and dropped 3 depth charges. HMS Snowflake arrived and added more depth charges. U-258 was damaged but survived, limping back to France for repairs. McKeesport was abandoned. Her crew of 42 men were rescued without casualties. Northern Gem scuttled the crippled freighter with gunfire to prevent her becoming a hazard to navigation. This was the only successful U-boat attack on ONS-5 during the night action of May 4th to 5th. 1 merchant ship sunk, 3 U-boats destroyed or forced to abort, 6 more U-boats driven off before achieving attack positions. The mathematics had reversed. Instead of U-boats overwhelming convoy escorts, escorts were overwhelming U-boats. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Admiral Dönitz, monitoring the battle from his headquarters in Paris, received contact reports from his submarine commanders with growing alarm. The reports described unusually aggressive escort tactics, British destroyers and corvettes charging directly at U-boats instead of evading, escorts maintaining contact and pressing attacks even when torpedoes were in the water. One report from U-264 stated, attacked convoy from ahead at 0430, fired spread of 4 torpedoes. British destroyer turned toward our boat and charged at high speed. Forced to dive before confirming hits, destroyer passed directly overhead and dropped pattern of depth charges. Severe damage to stern compartment, breaking off attack. Another from U-415. Surfaced to shadow convoy at dawn. Detected by radar at long range. Multiple escorts converged on position. Unable to dive before first destroyer arrived. Engaged with deck gun. Forced to crash dive under fire. Heavy depth charge attack followed. Lost contact with convoy. The pattern was clear. British convoy escorts had developed new tactics that neutralized the Wolfpack's numerical advantage. Instead of being overwhelmed by multiple simultaneous attacks, escorts were defeating U-boats individually through aggressive action. The battle around ONS-5 continued for 3 more days as the convoy approached the Newfoundland coast. On May 6th, fog settled over the convoy, dense fog, where visibility dropped to 100 yards. The escorts had been fitted with centimetric radar, a technological breakthrough that allowed detection of surfaced submarines even in 0 visibility. The U-boats had no equivalent technology. HMS Tay's radar detected 7 U-boats, positioned across the convoy's path. The submarines, unable to see the convoy or each other in the fog, were navigating blind, relying on radio reports from distant boats that still had visual or radar contact. The fog that blinded U-boats transformed the escorts into deadly hunters. British ships could see U-boats on radar while remaining invisible themselves. The tactical advantage was overwhelming. Throughout the night of May 6th to 7th, escorts engaged U-boats in the fog. HMS Loosestrife detected U-192 at 5,200 yards. The corvette closed to 500 yards before the U-boat detected the approaching ship and turned away, firing 2 torpedoes from stern tubes while diving. Both torpedoes missed. Loosestrife dropped 10 depth charges as the submarine passed beneath her. A slick of oil and debris marked where U-192 had been. The submarine was destroyed with all hands 49 men. HMS Oribe, her bow still damaged from collision with U-125, detected another submarine on radar at 200 yards. The U-boat was surfaced, crew on deck preparing to dive. Oribe's lookouts couldn't see the submarine through the fog, but the radar contact was solid. The destroyer opened fire with her main battery at point-blank range. 4.7-inch shells struck the U-boat's conning tower and pressure hull. The submarine attempted to dive but was mortally damaged. She surfaced again, crew abandoning ship as the boat sank. By dawn, on May 7th, the battle was over. ONS-5 entered the range of shore-based aircraft from Newfoundland. B-24 Liberator bombers appeared overhead, their presence forcing remaining U-boats to remain submerged, unable to pursue the convoy at speed. The final accounting was devastating for Germany. Of the 40 U-boats that participated in the attack on ONS-5, 6 were sunk outright: U-125, U-192, U-438, U-531, U-630, and U-954. 7 more were damaged so severely they required extensive repairs in French ports, removing them from operations for months. 5 additional boats reported damage requiring shorter repair periods. Against these losses, ONS-5 lost 13 merchant ships, 12 sunk by torpedo, 1 sunk by collision during the storm. Every ship that was hit carried ballast or minimal cargo. More importantly, convoy and escort casualties were remarkably light. 141 merchant seamen died. Only 2 Royal Navy personnel were killed. The exchange ratio was unprecedented. German submarine losses in boats and experienced crews far exceeded the value of ships and cargo they destroyed. Admiral Dönitz reviewed the battle reports with his staff in Paris. The numbers told a story that couldn't be ignored. U-boat losses in the North Atlantic during May 1943 totaled 41 boats, the highest monthly loss of the entire war. German submarine construction was producing new boats at approximately 20 per month. The simple mathematics showed U-boat losses exceeding production by 2 to 1. More troubling was the loss of experienced crews. Training a U-boat crew to operational effectiveness required months. The 49 men who died aboard U-192 represented tens of thousands of training hours. The experienced commanders killed in the battle men who had survived multiple patrols and understood the realities of anti-submarine warfare could not be replaced by fresh academy graduates. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz issued orders, withdrawing most U-boats from North Atlantic convoy routes. The decision represented Germany's admission of defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats would continue operations in the Atlantic for the remainder of the war, but never again would they threaten the Allied supply line sufficiently to affect the war's outcome. The turning point at ONS-5 resulted from multiple factors: improved radar and sonar, better trained escort crews, increased numbers of escort vessels, the addition of escort carriers providing air cover, code breaking that allowed convoys to route around known U-boat concentrations. But the tactical revolution, the shift from defensive evasion to aggressive engagement, proved decisive. Combing the tracks transformed how naval forces responded to torpedo attack. The principle was geometric and psychological. A ship turning away from torpedo tracks presented maximum target area while opening range on attacking submarines. Presented minimum target area while closing range on submarines, enabling aggressive counterattack. The mathematics were elegant. A typical merchant ship measured approximately 400 feet long and 50 feet wide. Broadside area, 20,000 square feet. Bow-on area, approximately 2,000 square feet. By turning into torpedo tracks, a ship reduced its target area by 90%. For torpedoes running on fixed courses at fixed depths, this geometric reduction was even more significant. A torpedo set to run at 12 feet depth and detonate on magnetic influence would pass harmlessly under or alongside a ship presenting its narrow bow profile. The same torpedo would strike and detonate against a ship presenting its broadside. The psychological impact extended beyond simple geometry. U-boat commanders had learned to expect specific responses from convoy escorts. Ships would turn away from attacks. Escorts would open range while attempting to regain contact. The Wolf pack could exploit this predictable behavior by coordinating attacks from multiple angles. When escorts began turning toward threats instead of away from them, U-boat attack plans collapsed. Submarines, expecting to launch torpedoes then dive to safety, found themselves under immediate depth charge attack. The aggressive response disrupted German tactical timing and forced submarines to break off attacks prematurely. Captain Donald McIntyre, one of the Royal Navy's most successful escort commanders, described the tactical shift in his post-war memoir. "We had learned that the best defense against the U-boat was aggressive offense. By turning toward torpedo tracks and charging the enemy, we achieved 2 results: First, we minimized our vulnerability to the weapons already in the water. Second, we maximized our ability to counterattack the submarine before it could fire additional weapons or escape. The tactic spread beyond the Atlantic. In the Pacific Theater, American destroyer crews adopted similar aggressive tactics against Japanese submarines and surface torpedo attacks. Commander Ernest Evans, commanding USS Johnston at the Battle of Samar in October 1944, charged directly at a Japanese battleship squadron firing torpedoes. Johnston's aggressive attack disrupted the Japanese formation and contributed to saving the American escort carriers behind her. The principle of turning toward threats rather than away from them influenced naval doctrine throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Modern naval tactics for countering missile attacks involve similar geometric principles, presenting minimum target aspect while closing range to engage the launch platform. But in May 1943, on the cold grey waters of the North Atlantic, the tactic was revolutionary. The men who executed these maneuvers, destroyer and corvette commanders steering directly toward torpedo tracks, demonstrated extraordinary courage. Every instinct, every previous tactical training, screamed to turn away, to open range, to survive first and fight second. Gilbert Roberts's war games in Liverpool had proven the tactic would work, but proof on a linoleum floor with model ships differed vastly from execution at sea, with real torpedoes approaching at 44 knots through storm-tossed waters. Lieutenant Harold Chesterman, commanding Snowflake when she turned bow on to 2 approaching torpedoes, later described the experience. "You watch the tracks coming at you, white lines in dark water. You know each torpedo carries 500 pounds of high explosive. You know if either one hits, your ship will likely sink. Every fibre of your being wants to turn away. But you hold course, you trust the mathematics, you trust the tactical unit's games, and you turn toward death." The torpedoes missed, the U-boat was driven off, the convoy survived. This pattern repeated across dozens of convoy battles in the summer and fall of 1943, escorts turning toward torpedo tracks, U-boats driven down and depth-charged before achieving effective attack positions, convoy losses declining, U-boat losses mounting. The Western Approach's tactical unit continued operations throughout the war. By 1945, over 5,000 Royal Navy and Allied naval officers had passed through the Liverpool facility. Each one spent days moving model ships across the linoleum floor, practicing responses to U-boat attacks, learning the principles that Gilbert Roberts and his Wrens had developed through systematic analysis of convoy battles. The Wrens who operated the tactical unit played an extraordinary role in naval history. These young women, most barely out of their teens, commanded model submarines with tactical sophistication that matched actual U-boat commanders. They studied German tactical manuals. They learned the capabilities and limitations of Type 7 and Type IX U-boats. They understood how weather, visibility, and convoy composition affected attack options. Jean Laidlaw, who had helped Roberts prove that U-boats were attacking from inside convoy columns, became one of the unit's senior tactical instructors. By war's end, she had participated in over 2,000 simulated convoy battles. Her expertise in U-boat tactics exceeded that of many operational submarine commanders. Janet O'Kell, the other Wren who stayed late that critical evening when Roberts first demonstrated combing the tracks to Admiral Houghton, received the British Empire Medal for her contributions to developing anti-submarine tactics. The citation specifically mentioned her role in tactical innovations that contributed significantly to victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. Admiral Houghton later wrote that the Western Approach's tactical unit's contribution to Allied victory was incalculable. The ability to train escort commanders in realistic tactical scenarios, to develop and test new doctrines before implementing them at sea, and to analyze actual convoy battles to extract lessons. All of this created a feedback loop that continuously improved Allied anti-submarine effectiveness. The Germans had nothing equivalent. U-boat training focused on individual boat operations. Tactical coordination between submarines in wolfpack attacks was improvised and poorly practiced. German submarine commanders learned their trade through actual combat experience, a learning process that proved increasingly lethal as Allied defenses improved. By late 1943, the average U-boat patrol lasted only 2 to 3 missions before the boat was sunk. New commanders arriving at French submarine bases had minimal chances of survival. The experienced officers who had fought in the early war years, men who understood British convoy tactics and had developed effective attack methods, were nearly all dead. The contrast with British escort commanders was stark. Officers arriving to command destroyers or corvettes in convoy duty had already fought dozens of simulated battles at the tactical unit. They understood U-boat capabilities intimately. They had practiced aggressive tactics until they became instinctive. When they encountered real U-boats at sea, they were prepared. Commander Peter Gretton, who commanded the escort group during the ONS-5 battle, survived the war and eventually reached the rank of Vice Admiral. In his memoirs, he described the tactical unit's impact. "Before Liverpool, we were learning by dying. Every mistake cost ships and lives. After Liverpool, we learned by playing games on a floor." The shift from reactive tactics, responding to whatever the U-boats did, to proactive tactics, forcing U-boats to respond to our actions, changed everything. The principle of turning toward threats extended beyond torpedo evasion. Escort commanders who had trained at the tactical unit developed a fundamentally more aggressive approach to anti-submarine warfare. When radar detected a surfaced U-boat, the instinctive response was to charge directly at maximum speed. This forced the submarine to dive immediately before it could achieve a favorable attack position. The U-boat, designed for surface speed of 17 knots and submerged speed of only 7 knots, lost any speed advantage once forced underwater. When ASDIC sonar gained contact with a submerged submarine, escorts would coordinate immediate depth charge attacks rather than waiting to develop the contact fully. The aggressive approach accepted some risk of losing contact in exchange for maximizing the pressure on the enemy. U-boats, forced to dive deep, maneuver violently, and endure depth charge attacks, couldn't simultaneously maintain contact with convoys and prepare torpedo attacks. The tactics worked because they exploited fundamental limitations of submarine warfare. U-boats were fragile vessels, operating in an inherently hostile environment. Submerged, they were blind, slow, and dependent on limited battery power. Surfaced, they were vulnerable to gunfire and ramming. The window of opportunity when a submarine could effectively engage a convoy was narrow. Aggressive escort tactics closed that window. Statistics demonstrate the effectiveness. In 1942, before the tactical unit's doctrines were widely implemented, U-boats sank approximately 1 merchant ship for every U-boat lost a 1-to-1 exchange ratio. By late 1943, after aggressive tactics became standard, the ratio had reversed to approximately 6 U-boats sunk for every merchant ship lost. The campaign's turning point came in May 1943, the month that included the ONS-5 battle. 41 U-boats sunk, 299,000 tons of merchant shipping lost. The exchange ratio heavily favored the Allies. June 1943 saw only 17 merchant ships sunk in the North Atlantic, totaling 95,000 tons. U-boat losses remained high at 17 boats. The trend continued through the summer and fall. By November 1943, not a single merchant ship was sunk in North Atlantic convoy operations. The Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over. Germany continued submarine operations for the remainder of the war, but never again threatened Allied supply lines sufficiently to affect strategic outcomes. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 required moving millions of tons of supplies and hundreds of thousands of troops across the Atlantic. The operation proceeded without significant interference from U-boats. The convoys that had been savaged in 1942 now sailed with near immunity. The transformation resulted from multiple factors working in combination: technological improvements, better radar, more effective sonar, forward-throwing weapons like Hedgehog that allowed escorts to attack submarines without losing sonar contact, increased numbers of escorts, destroyer escorts and frigates, built specifically for convoy duty, very long-range aircraft that closed the mid-Atlantic air gap, and, critically, tactical innovations that shifted convoy defense from passive protection to aggressive hunting. Combing the tracks represented the visible manifestation of this broader tactical revolution. The specific maneuver turning toward torpedo tracks embodied principles that extended across all aspects of anti-submarine warfare. Face the threat, close the distance, attack aggressively. These principles contradicted the cautious doctrine that had emerged from the Battle of Jutland 27 years earlier. They represented a fundamental rethinking of how naval forces should respond to underwater attack. The cost of learning these lessons was measured in ships and lives. Between September 1939 and May 1943, U-boats sank over 2,300 merchant ships in the Atlantic. More than 30,000 merchant seamen died. The ships represented millions of tons of cargo food, fuel, weapons, raw materials needed to sustain Britain's war effort. Every ship that reached port carried supplies that kept Britain in the war. Every ship sunk represented a strategic loss that had to be made up through increased production or reduced consumption. The mathematics of the Atlantic campaign were simple. If U-boats sank ships faster than Allied shipyards could build them, Britain would starve. If ship construction exceeded losses, Britain would survive. The tactics developed at the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, implemented by escort commanders across the North Atlantic, ensured that construction exceeded losses. The margin was sometimes thin in early 1943, the balance nearly tipped toward Germany. But the aggressive tactics introduced that spring reversed the trend decisively. Gilbert Roberts, the retired naval officer with heart problems who created the tactical unit, received the Commander of Order of the British Empire for his contributions. The honour was thoroughly deserved but inadequately reflected the magnitude of his achievement. Roberts had created a system that transformed tactical development from an art to a science. The linoleum floor at Derby House, with its white lines and model ships, represented a revolution in naval warfare. For the first time, commanders could practice and refine tactics without risking ships and lives. The simulated battles allowed rapid iteration, trying different approaches, analysing results, implementing the most effective solutions. This methodology extended beyond World War II. Modern naval training incorporates similar principles. Computer simulations have replaced linoleum floors, but the concept remains identical. Practice tactics in simulation before implementing them in combat. Analyze actual engagements to extract lessons. Continuously refine doctrine based on operational experience. The US Navy established its own tactical training facilities during the war, directly inspired by Roberts's work. The Fleet Sonar School in Key West, Florida, taught anti-submarine warfare using similar wargaming techniques. American destroyer escort commanders practiced convoy defense scenarios before deploying to the Atlantic. The principle of turning toward threats influenced American doctrine in the Pacific Theater. In surface actions against Japanese forces, American destroyers consistently demonstrated aggressive tactics, charging enemy formations, launching torpedoes at close range, engaging in gun duels at ranges where Japanese superiority in night optics became less decisive. Commander Ernest Evans, aboard USS Johnston at the Battle off Samar, exemplified this aggressive spirit. When his destroyer screen encountered a Japanese battleship squadron, including the massive Yamato, Evans immediately attacked. Johnston charged directly at the Japanese force, firing torpedoes and guns. The destroyer was eventually sunk, but her aggressive action disrupted the Japanese formation and contributed to saving the escort carriers she was protecting. Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism and valorous fighting spirit. But the tactics Evans employed, turning toward a superior enemy, attacking aggressively despite overwhelming odds, reflected the same principles developed on a linoleum floor in Liverpool. The counterintuitive nature of combing the tracks remained its most striking feature. Human instinct, when faced with approaching danger, favors evasion over confrontation. Running from threats is a deeply embedded survival mechanism. Turning toward threats requires conscious override of instinct through training and discipline. Convoy escort commanders who turned their ships bow on to approaching torpedoes had to trust mathematics and training over instinct. They had to believe that presenting a smaller target while closing with the enemy will produce better outcomes than presenting a larger target while opening range. The fact that this principle worked consistently across hundreds of engagements demonstrated that systematic analysis could overcome instinct. The tactical unit's war games had proven the principle. Operational experience confirmed it. Commanders who followed the doctrine survived and achieved success. Those who reverted to instinct and turned away suffered higher losses. This lesson extended beyond naval warfare. Throughout military history, tactical innovations that contradict instinct often prove most effective. Infantry advancing toward enemy fire rather than taking cover. Aircraft turning into attacks rather than diving away. Ships charging toward threats rather than retreating. The common principle, understanding the geometry and mathematics of combat, allows optimization of tactics beyond instinctive responses. Training can reprogram instinct. Simulation allows practice without consequence. Systematic analysis extracts principles that work consistently. The Battle of the Atlantic demonstrated these principles on a strategic scale. The campaign's outcome affected the entire course of World War II. If Germany had succeeded in cutting Britain's supply lines, the European war might have ended differently. Without British bases, the invasion of Europe would have been impossible. Without American supplies, Britain couldn't have sustained her war effort. Combing the tracks, a specific tactical maneuver practiced on a floor in Liverpool, contributed to preventing that outcome. The tactic didn't win the Battle of the Atlantic single-handedly, but it represented the kind of tactical innovation, systematically developed and widely implemented, that gave the Allies a decisive advantage. By war's end, approximately 7,500 convoys had crossed the Atlantic. Of the hundreds of thousands of ships that sailed in these convoys, approximately 3,000 were sunk, roughly 0.4%. The convoy system, combined with aggressive escort tactics, had proven remarkably effective at protecting merchant shipping. The U-boat force, which began the war with only 57 submarines, ultimately operated over 1,100 boats. Of these, 783 were sunk. Over 30,000 German submariners served in U-boats during the war. 28,000 died, a 75% casualty rate, the highest of any military service in any nation during World War II. These statistics reflected the shift from defensive to offensive tactics. Early in the war, U-boats hunted convoys. By late 1943, convoys hunted U-boats. Escorts equipped with radar, sonar, and hedgehog mortars, commanded by officers trained in aggressive tactics, turned the hunted into hunters. The men who served on escort duty, destroyer and corvette crews who spent months at sea in the North Atlantic's brutal conditions rarely received the recognition given to more visible military services. Fighter pilots, bomber crews, and infantry soldiers appeared in newsreels and newspapers. Convoy escorts operated in obscurity, their contributions known only through the statistics of supplies delivered and U-boats sunk. A corvette crew's typical day at sea involved 24 hours of watches, maintenance, and readiness. Ships rolled violently in North Atlantic seas. Water came aboard constantly. Interior spaces were cramped, damp, and cold. Food consisted of whatever could be prepared in a galley that pitched 30 degrees in both directions. Sleep came in brief intervals between watches. When action occurred, it erupted with shocking suddenness. Radar contact, general quarters, maximum speed toward the contact, depth charges ready, hedgehog loaded. Then the waiting while sonar tracked the submerged target. The pattern dropped. Explosions. Waiting to see if the submarine surfaced or if oil and debris indicated a kill. If neither appeared, the process repeated. Track, attack, wait. Hours could pass in this cycle. Successful attacks meant a U-boat destroyed and 45 to 50 German submariners dead. Unsuccessful attacks meant the submarine escaped to attack another convoy. The moral calculus was straightforward but never easy. Escort crews killed to prevent being killed. They hunted submarines to protect merchantmen. The men they killed were doing exactly the same thing. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The legacy of combing the tracks extended far beyond World War II. The principle of turning toward threats became embedded in naval tactical doctrine. Modern warships facing anti-ship missiles employ similar geometry, presenting minimum aspect while launching countermeasures and engaging the launch platform. The broader lesson that systematic analysis, simulation, and training can develop counterintuitive tactics that prove more effective than instinct-influenced military thinking across all services. The concept of the war game as a tool for developing and testing tactics became standard practice. Gilbert Roberts died in 1983 at age 95. His obituaries mentioned his naval career and his work at the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, but few recognized the revolutionary nature of his contribution. He had created a methodology that transformed how militaries develop tactics. The linoleum floor in Liverpool was as significant an innovation as any weapon system developed during the war. The Wrens, who worked at the tactical unit, largely returned to civilian life after the war. Their contributions were classified for years. When details finally emerged, public recognition came slowly. Jean Laidlaw and Janet O'Kell, the two women who had helped Roberts demonstrate combing the tracks to Admiral Horton, received medals and commendations, decades after their service. The tactical unit itself closed shortly after VE Day. The building at Derby House was repurposed. The linoleum floor was eventually replaced. The model ships, carefully crafted miniatures of destroyers, corvettes, and U-boats, were dispersed or destroyed. The physical artifacts of the place where naval tactical doctrine was revolutionized disappeared. But the principles remained: turn toward threats, present minimum target profile, close with the enemy, attack aggressively. These concepts, developed through systematic gaming on a Liverpool floor, taught to thousands of escort commanders, applied in hundreds of convoy battles, became foundational to modern naval warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic was ultimately won through the cumulative effect of many factors: better technology, more ships, improved training, code breaking, air cover, escort carriers, hunter-killer groups. Each element contributed to Allied victory. But among these factors, the tactical revolution represented by combing the tracks stands out for its counterintuitive nature and its significant impact. By challenging the conventional wisdom established at Jutland, by proving through systematic analysis that turning toward threats produced better outcomes than turning away, Gilbert Roberts and his team changed how navies thought about underwater warfare. The merchant seamen who died in Convoy, battles 30,000 of them, never saw the tactical unit's flaw or understood the principles being developed to protect them. They simply went to sea, repeatedly, knowing the risks. Their ships carried the food, fuel, and weapons that sustained Britain through her darkest years. Their sacrifice made victory possible. The U-boat crews, who died 28,000 German submariners, fought in what they knew was a losing campaign. By mid-1943, experienced U-boat commanders understood the mathematics, but they continued to sail on patrol, continued to attack convoys, continued to fight against increasingly hopeless odds. They were following orders in a war they didn't start, dying in a conflict they couldn't win. The escort commanders who turned their ships toward torpedo tracks, men like Peter Gretton, Harold Chesterman, and hundreds of others, demonstrated extraordinary courage. They followed doctrine that contradicted every instinct. They trusted training over fear. They turned toward death and, by doing so, more often survived. This was the essence of combing the tracks, not just a tactical maneuver, but a fundamental reorientation of how naval forces responded to threats. The principle that facing danger directly, with proper understanding and preparation, produces better outcomes than evasion. The tactic saved convoys. The convoys saved Britain. Britain's survival made Allied victory possible. The chain of causation extended from a linoleum floor in Liverpool to the outcome of the greatest war in human history, and it began with a counterintuitive principle, proven through systematic gaming, implemented through aggressive training, validated through combat experience. Turn toward the torpedoes, comb the tracks, face the threat. This was how convoys survived. This was how the Atlantic was won.